Did we talk about owners?
No, man.
Yeah, man.
What'd you say?
Am I wrong?
No one in class remembers it.
Then I could be wrong. But I thought it was at the end of last class. Did we not?
No.
Did we talk about that? What's that about?
You try to get your employer to pay for it.
Because you're the...
Because, what?
Oh? Yes, we did.
I didn't have to do with owners, it was bosses.
It's not bosses, buddy. It's owners. Vicarious liability is a concept that applies to owners. The owners are responsible for if what?
The employee committed toward,
Yeah? And
and they were doing their job.
what they were doing, not how. Don't do that. Not and they were doing their job. That's a bad test. What they were doing, not how, was part of their job. So there is an issue in here where somebody else committed a tort or may have committed a tort, and that is meant to have you go to vicarious liability of why Alex could be sued for that tort, and it has to do with the food. Alex never prepared that food. Could she be sued? If we proved that tort. Could she be sued?
As the owner of the establishment, yes. Yes.
That's what that's for. Okay? And if you don't get hints in an open book exam, it's not going to say, please go to vicarious liability. Right? It's just thrown out there. And you've got to make that connection because you know your stuff. If you can't, there's no way you'll find that. Because you don't even know where to look. You don't even know what it's about. And if you know what it's about, if you go, I understand that's vicarious liability, it's going to have to do with vicarious liability. Do you have to then look up what vicarious liability is? No, you knew it, right? But you got to understand that. The problem with that is, it's not the greatest example because the tort isn't proven. It's not a great example. But if you ask me why that's there, it would have to be related to the owner being responsible for the actions of the owner.
Sorry, in my notes, and another few since I have the word we have as employer. And I feel like that's what we recorded, is the employer is responsible.
It is, but it's not, who is the employer? Is it your boss? Is your manager your employer?
No.
Okay.
See, the word is right. It's actually the employer.
Okay.
But the employer is the,
Yourself.
which is the, yeah,
Okay.
right? So again, you may not get it exactly the same as it said, but you got to be able to make that connection. It's not the boss, though. The boss to me is the manager. A manager is not liable. It's the ownership. It's actually, employer is actually the right word. So if she owns that hotel, is she the employer?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Go ahead.
So then would you place all of these liabilities under defenses for negligence? Or are they kind of a separate thing? Or are they kind of
What liability?
like, the one that we just talked about?
Occupier's liability, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Liability.
Okay, I need to make this clear. Vicarious liability is not a tort. It is not a tort. It's not, there's 7 torts. One of them is not vicarious liability. Okay? Vicarious liability is a method of making an employer pay for the actions, the torts of employees. It's a way of getting someone to pay, but it's not a tort itself. There has to be a different tort, and it has to be performed by the employee. Right? So we have, the requirements are an employee commits a tort, and what they were doing and not how was part of their job. So if we're dealing with the negligence of serving the food, Alex never made that food, did she? So could Bob sue Alex? Did the employee, if we prove that this was a tort, if he'd gotten sick, would he be able to sue Alex? That's really what that fact is about.
So just clarify for me where vicarious liability fits in the 5-step process.
Yeah, like where would it go if you were trying to go through like a question for negligence or like any other kind of question?
Is it almost like after a defense?
No. It's after, but it's about who gets sued. You have to prove a tort. Okay? So the steps prove the tort and who's liable. So it's kind of, I get your question now, okay? It would go here. So you deal with the outcome of the tort would be this thing. And then you'd say, and because of vicarious liability, if you proved it, you put the test for it, right? To show your knowledge, that's key on this exam. Show you understand it. Don't just throw down things and say yes or no. Tell me the test when there's tests. Explain it fully. Full explanation of everything you're doing. And you'd say that the employer could be sued could be found liable as well. That's what it is. Or sued as well. Or have to pay as well. Because you proved the tort. And then you can get after the employer too. So that's where it would go. It's kind of gets tacked on at the end. Once liability's been established, you say, and by the way, he could go after her too because of vicarious liability.
That's something that exists. The plaintiff would have to push for that? Or place for a lawyer? A different lawyer?
They would sue them both. So if we have, the problem with that fact situation is, if you do not prove that the restaurant staff is served bad food because there was no harm, there was no negligence because there was no harm, then there is no action that Alex would be liable for that wasn't one that she did. She's the person that committed the tort. With me on that? So, the way you would prove this is to say, would a reasonable person in the position of the defendant foresee that if you serve food that is bad, somebody could get hurt, go through, and let's say that there was harm, then you'd say, well, the employee is actually the person who committed that tort. Whoever prepared the food badly, there isn't someone named, but you know that somebody did it. They could be sued for what they did. But then at the end you'd say, and since Alec is the employer, and this would meet the test of vicarious liability, which is an employee committed a tort, and what they were doing, preparing food, not how, was part of their job, then Alex could be sued through. That's it. It's just a little thing that would get tacked on at the end, depending on who's being sued. Anytime you know something that is tied to the facts, you should be dealing with it. But I am going to tell you something now that is really important about the exam. It's kind of good news, bad news. No. So I've got a couple little points that I want to make. First of all, as I said before, be really prepared. Know your stuff. Know it backwards and forwards. Do not come in relying on your notes. It's a mistake. Bring them. That's also a mistake to not bring them because you may need them, okay? And don't bring them on a computer. They've got to be on paper by the time you get to class. But bring those things, okay? So you know your stuff. You brought in this thing, okay? You do not want to answer questions and give an answer. You want to show you understand this concept. So that means taking more time and fleshing it out. But I have to have a little bit more control in an exam than this wide open, So what happens in the exam is, need to back up just a minute. Do not go in there thinking that the exam is all about torts. A lot of times people get so focused on this last thing, they forget that there's a whole other world out there. You got to understand Constitution, you got to understand law process. There's going to be, I told you before, a small claim that you have to fill out. Yeah, easy peasy. All right? But if we're going back to the idea of fully explaining things and making sure you understand it, when you get to a question that is a case study about torts, and there's no secret, folks, there's going to be two of them, okay? What happens in the case study is I'm not asking you to deal with 17 things like you have up here. In this case study we gave you, there was probably 30 negligences, including the one that we didn't deal with, which is where you kind of went, which is failing to check the weather before she went.
Who's a boat captain? You should know the forecast.
Don't say should. Bad boy. Okay? But failing to check the weather. That will actually fly. Because if she had checked the weather, would he still have had the wave? That's the one that actually would probably fly. And there could be something else, that she didn't do. Failing to, teach him how to work a life jacket. All that. There's so many. So in the exam, I cannot deal with that because I have to have a consistent marking criteria that I can apply to all of you, no matter what. And for that reason, what we do on this is that you get a fact situation, and if you know your stuff, there should be one tort that is the right and obviously the right. It fits. Okay? If you get the wrong one, it will cost you. It won't cost you everything. That's the bad news. So the good news is, for each case study, I'm telling you to deal with one primary tort. It's the one that if you had to argue, it would be the one that would get argued. It's what the case is about. Okay? And it should be fairly obvious. And then it says right on the test, you have to go through the process. You can't just answer a question. You've got to go through the process properly. I do not think that this exam is particularly difficult. Okay? I really don't. It's not as hard as this. I always do this, folks. I push you to nasty, and then we back up, and then you go, oh, this wasn't that bad. Right? But this is a little on the nasty side. But part of the nastiness is you just don't know what you're doing yet, right? Now that you see this, if you had a negligence question, could you deal with it? Yeah, you should be able to. It might be a little fussy in this, the everyone knows thing. People sometimes have trouble with that. But I'm just trying to get you to put something down, and then you walk your way through, you follow through, you do all the steps, you're done. You show your knowledge. Anything that you can raise, you fully discuss, you're done. But that's what happens on the exam. It says, and it'll say that. So the first question is basically, what tort is this? And that's really doing the sniff test, right? Things. And then it says, okay, using the process, analyze it. Got it? Okay. I'm going to take I don't know, how much long a break do you want? 5 minutes or 10 minutes? How many people want 5 minutes and be out of here earlier? How many people want 10 minutes because you need it? We'll go 10. Okay, and while you're doing that, I am going to be erasing this board when we come back to class, so if you feel that you want to take a picture of it, or you have to take more notes down about it, it's going to be gone in 10 minutes. Just about vicarious liability has triggered something that I think I need to deal with. I find that students in this particular course find it kind of unsettling because they just don't know when to do, what to do, when to do that. And it actually gets worse in the next section of the course. So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a mindset. Okay, first of all, what students do and you're really trained to do this. I'm trying to untrain you to do this, which is you're trained to answer questions. And you're trained to get those answers right. And if you get answers right, you should get marks, right? That's the way you do it. This course doesn't work like that. What you're trained to do is follow a process and show your thoughts. It's by showing your thoughts, you're showing that you understand the material. It's not by getting the answers right. There aren't right answers all the time. So the process is designed in such a way that you can get to an answer that is valid and you can show your reasoning. It's designed partly because that's the way it works, but partly because I need it. Right? You're doing it so that you can show the knowledge. So that question about vicarious liability and where does it go and when does it go and how do you fit it in it's not the right way to think. The way that I think about this is that facts create triggers. They create bang, bang, those two things, that has happened. Okay? Facts create triggers. And when facts fully trigger or partly trigger certain things you've learned about, you've got to stick them in there somewhere. Because you're showing me that you can see that and that are there. So if you have an employee who is sued and Alex is the employer, you're going to, if you see the trigger, see an employee committed a tort, and what they were doing, not how was part of the work, Alex could be sued. You're showing you understand that. There aren't any hints. You've got to know your stuff so that it kind of sets off a little bang. It's almost like you're looking for everything at once. And when you see it, it pops out at you, and then the other thing comes and you pop out and you go, we got it. Right? And that's hard because it's not linear completely. And this is why contracts is much more difficult, is because there are several things that are happening at once, and which one you go to is completely triggered by facts. And you got to know them all because that can happen, and that can happen, and that can happen. So I'm glad that we got asked that, because it really points out the importance of showing your knowledge. And your knowledge is, you know how to apply these rules, that's law, to facts. And the facts are used so that you can show your knowledge of the rules. And you can identify things without any guidance or input. All right? So, I want to deal with this unlawful confinement, and I'm going to erase the rest of this. Are you all okay? It's going. Ain't done. Because we need the space. So, let's deal with the unlawful confinement tort, which would be tying up Bob. Would you agree that that should trigger unlawful confinement? You should see that, right? Like, she's tied up some guy. What tort would that be? Or could it be? Unlawful confinement. Right? So the next thing you will do is you will write out these. Was there deprivation of liberty? Was it against the will of the plaintiff? And was it caused by the defendant? Because those are the elements for unlawful confinement, and they don't change. If that's here, these are here. Right? Got that? And then we get to the third step. That this is the one that students sometimes have problems with. I need an answer to this, but I also need to see how you did this. And with most things, what you're looking for can be explained. In other words, there's a reason why you're coming up with that answer. And I need you to show me, what are you looking for? What is the core to this, right? So that is, what does deprivation of liberty mean? What are you looking for when you decide if there's going to be a deprivation of liberty? What are you looking for?
If the person is able
Yeah, means that they were unable to move freely. That is the test. Now, if we're looking for that, we now go to facts, which is, all right, what facts tell you whether he was able to move freely or not? What?
Down at the hands and feet.
Yeah, Bob was tied up. So, now if you go on and deal with a bunch of other crap here, it's because you're not staying focused on what you're looking for. We're only looking at one thing. Was he able to move freely? So sometimes people will put things like, because Alex tied up his hands and she was drunk and she shouldn't have done that, shouldn't, bad, right? And stuff. That's all garbage. We're looking for, he couldn't move freely because, what are the facts? He was tied up. If you put he was bound hands and feet, that's good. If you put he was tied up, that's good. But you're going to deal with this and he didn't want it and everything else here and here. And you've got to keep these things kind of separate. We're only dealing with could he move freely. So if this is the test and this is the fact, tell me what the outcome is. When you're tied up, you can't move freely. And therefore, there was a what?
Deprivation of liberty.
Yeah. Bring it around. So this is a classic example of, you tell me the test, what you're looking for, you tell me the facts, and then you say if they can't move freely, then if they're tied up, they can't move freely, so that is going to be that. And you okay. Was it against the will? What does against the will mean?
Did he want to?
How do you know? With facts. Maybe he loved it. Maybe he was going, oh, this is really nice. How do you know?
Didn't say he hollered or something?
Something. Well, if there are no facts, then you're going to go to how are you getting to the answer? If there were no facts, right? What would be your answer? Would it be against his will or not? What would be your guess as to the answer? Okay, it would be against his will, probably. How do you know that? Because people don't like to be tied up. That is a good reasoning, but in this case, there are actually facts. How do you know?
He find the sharp edge.
What?
He find the sharp edge to set him free.
Is that important, folks? If you're trying to determine if it's against his will, he tried to cut himself loose. What does that show you?
He don't want to.
He didn't want to be tied up. You could also, there's another thing that says, I think it says he was petrified, right? If he's petrified, that means he wouldn't want it. All of these are facts that support it. You've got to get there somehow. Okay? So if you picked one fact and said, the fact that he tried to free himself and said, therefore he didn't want to, I would accept that. If you said, oh, he was petrified, he wouldn't have wanted to be petrified, so he couldn't, it must have been against his will, I would accept that. If you said both, I would probably put nice work. But you don't get any more marks for it, right? Because you're showing a couple of things that all point in the same direction. But the point I'm looking for is, do you have a test? Do you have a fact? And then a conclusion is, he tried to free himself by finding a sharp object. and cutting rope. The fact that he tried to free himself. Means he did not want to be tied. So, it was
Against the will of
Against the will.
against his will. That's it, folks. Easy peasy. This isn't hard, right? It's just being a little fussy about your answers, okay? Don't cut corners. Was it caused by the defendant? In this case, what does caused by the defendant mean?
Was he tied up by Alex?
Yeah. Alex is the defendant. Right? That's what we're looking for. Is that Anne who tied him up? Here's the fact. She tied him up. So, it was caused by defendant. There you go. So, this, with the intentional tort, this is number one. This is your snare. Here's your action that could be a tort. This is number two. Here's your elements. This is number three. Here's your reasoning, numbering the elements, 1, 2, or 3 in here so that I can connect your answer to the element. And you don't have the problem, I don't have the problem of saying, I don't know if this is still answering that or what it is. I like them numbered. It shows me where we're at, nice and clear. And then you're going to put what for step 4?
All elements are present. The tort is proof.
Great answer. Now what? What defenses could reasonably be argued?
Defense of property.
Yeah. Anything else? Anything else? Yes or no?
Legal authority. She's the owner of the boat.
Is there a law that allows her to tie up somebody? Ben, there might be, okay? But I cannot have you come to that conclusion based on outside knowledge or not something everyone else. If I want you to come to the conclusion, I've got to give you the information that you can come there. Okay? The absence of information means I don't want you to do that, right? So I'd have to tell you, boat owners have the lawful authority to do this, because how would you know that? You know, if there's lawful authority, unless they tell you what the law is about that, okay? Or it'd have to be something obvious, like police have the lawful right, but even that isn't that obvious because it's very technical when they actually have the lawful right to arrest. But
Her own self-defense.
is there a self-defense possibility?
She wants to defend herself from harm. There's a storm coming. It's her boat. She doesn't know how to drive a boat.
Absolutely.
That's not the right tort, though.
Self-defense is a general,
Oh.
right?
Yes.
And can you use it with this?
Yes.
And should you use it with this?
Yes.
So, you have this, this, this. What you will do now is you will deal with the test for each of these. So, you'll deal with these one at a time. Defensive property. What's the test for defensive property? Was she?
Defending her property.
And?
Was it not excessive?
Not using obviously excessive force. That's the question. So it's actually got two parts to it. Was she defending her property when she tied him up?
Yes.
Was the force obviously excessive?
Yeah.
How many people say yeah, it was? Okay, what less could she have done?
Wow, good.
How would that work?
Probably not.
Why not? There's a fact, folks.
He said, I will not be stopped.
That fact is there so that you will deal with the is this obviously excessive? Did she shoot him?
No.
Did she throw him to the sharks?
No, she left him there.
Arguably.
Yeah, but tying him up, what less could she have done? And that's not even the test. The test isn't could she have done less. It was, is it obviously excessive? But what less could she have done?
Nothing.
I don't know, much less. And really, it wasn't that bad thing, right? Tie him up for 5 minutes, he calms down. That isn't like obviously excessive. So, was she defending her property from harm and not using force that's obviously excessive? This is what you would write down. And you'd say she was defending her boat because he didn't know how to drive it. And because he said, I will not be stopped, it does not appear that her actions were overly obviously excessive. She didn't throw him to the sharks. She didn't shoot him. She just tied him up for a few minutes. Obviously excessive, folks? No. Okay? And therefore, what would happen? That defense would be
Valid.
valid. So now you know the answer. Do we deal with the rest of them? Always. Okay? Necessity. What's the test? You'd have to write this down, folks. I'm cutting corner here by not writing it down for you. But the test would be what? The test for necessity is
Harm done versus harm prevented.
is the harm that she did less than the harm she was trying to prevent?
Yeah.
Now we have to deal with what was the harm she did. Tying him up. That's it. That's the tort. That's the action, right? We're not talking about negligence and falling overboard. We're talking about him tying him up. What was the harm she was trying to prevent?
Him crashing her boat.
Okay, what harm would result from that? It could be a severe property damage, and if he drove it, what else is she trying to prevent? Death. Right? Is the harm that she did, tying him up, less than the harm preventing? It's capsizing the boat, killing them both. And if you apply that test, you're going to come to the conclusion that that defense is
Valid.
valid. Go on to self-defense. What's the test?
Defending herself from harm.
And not using force that's obviously excessive. Was she defending herself from harm? If he'd driven the boat, could she have been hurt?
Yeah.
Did he have every good reason to believe she would be hurt?
Yeah.
He's never operated a boat before. And there he is, right? And? So was she defending herself from harm? Yeah, she thought she was going to kill him. You're going to kill us both. Why is that there? Why is the fact there? It's so that you'll come to the conclusion that she's doing self-defense. And is it obviously excessive to tie him up to prevent herself from being seriously hurt by the boat? No, it's not obviously excessive, and therefore, that defense is approved. How many does she need?
One.
She needs one. How many does she have?
All three.
So, in the next step, you're going to say what? Although the tort is proved, she has 3 complete defenses. These are not partial defenses like contributory negligence or provocation. They're full defenses, and therefore, the defendant would win. And you'd say all of that, not just write this down, like I did. Right?
So that's the end of it. We're the judge, we've heard all the facts. We heard the tort was proved, the defenses are there, the defenses are proved. There's no extra rebuttal, there's no more arguing. The defenses are in place to defend them.
For that action. Right? We're not talking about anything else, right? We're talking about that action. That she had every legal right to do that, there's a lawful, valid defense, and when Bob sued her for being tied up, he would, in the end, lose. Okay? All right. So now, we're going to go to the next one I want to deal with, is let's deal with conversion. How many people are finally starting to understand what we need to do? This is usually where it happens, folks. You suddenly go, okay, I see why we did this, where it fits, what we need to do. And there's a nice process that people generally like, but it should, at some point, make some good basic sense. Okay? And that's all we're after at this point. So, is there a conversion on the facts?